Hi, I'm Gary Bowles, the Chair for the Future of Work with Singularity University, and welcome to the Great Reset of Education. I don't think it has been an unknown memo to anybody in the world that we're going through one of the most pivotal times in human learning in modern history. And so we wanted to be able to have a series of discussions that we could hopefully be helpful to people around the world in the ways that education and learning are changing and some of the things that we might be able to do to not just deal with these challenging and exceptional times, but to be able to build better for the future. I want to introduce you to my guests, but first I just wanted to, I'm going to post in the chat stream. If you want to offer something in the chat stream, and I would strongly encourage you to make this a constant flow of ideas. What I'm suggesting is if you have a question, start it with a question mark so that we can call that out. If you have an insight or something else that you would like others who are online to be able to understand, then please post that. No commercials. Please don't post links, but certainly offer perspective. And then if you're not certain you agree with something, you want to call, wait a minute, put an asterisk. And so that would help us to be able to see some of the thoughts that you're having. I always say when people ask me, what have we gained and what have we lost in this period? One of the things we've gained is the ability to have this amazing reach to so many people. In our classrooms, we didn't have quite so many people that we could talk to, but we also have gained the ability to actually see the thought bubbles of people as we're having these discussions. So we want to see your thought bubbles. So let me introduce my guests, and I'm tremendously pleased to have such towering perspectives with us. So first, Esther Wojcicki, there's the list of accomplishments in her resume would take up the majority of our time here. But suffice to say that she is an educator. She actually just recently retired from teaching at Palo Alto High, the journalism program here in the Bay Area. I'm based in San Francisco. She's the author of books like Moonshots in Education and How to Raise Successful People. She is catalyzing a set of different companies, which we'll want to have her talk about, related to learning and how we can have much better learning in this pivot that we're going through. And she's a global speaker. She's constantly sought on daises around the world to talk about the ways to think about differently about how to educate. Fernando Reimers is, again, a list of accomplishments that's just stunning. Ford Foundation Professor of Practice in International Education with Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's on UNESCO's Commission on the Future of Education. He's also a many-time author of books like Educating Students to Improve the World. He's also written children's books to help children to understand some of the things, some of the ways that they can understand the world better. And so I welcome Esther and Fernando. Thank you so much for joining me. So I'm going to start off with, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you. So I'm just going to start off with setting the table. And then it's a discussion. It's a discussion with our attendees, and it's a discussion with our, between us as well about some of the things that we can be, ways to think differently about this period that we're in. So back in March, I wrote a piece that actually got published on Techonomy in early April called The Great Reset. And my premise was that I don't think this is simply just a pause, because that's the way a lot of people were talking about it at the time. I don't think this is like we're all sitting around waiting for something to restart. I think we've actually hit the reset button. And I think we're realizing that we can stop our economies on a dime when something like a pandemic appears. We can stop a whole bunch of activity, especially when it comes to things like how we learn and where we learn. And we can simply and rapidly try to adapt, try to respond and react to those changes. And we're actually probably a little better adaptive than we thought we might be, at least initially. But it's a reset because I think of it as sort of three phases. There's this sort of beginning, sort of falling off the cliff phase. Like we don't know. We all stopped all this activity. We're not getting together. And how long is that going to last? Tons of uncertainty. And I said, well, I think we're going to shift eventually into this second phase of sort of, if the first phase was just surviving, then hopefully there'll be a revive phase where we do start to put pieces back together. But it's not going to be a normal. It's going to be a new abnormal. That is, there's going to be a whole bunch of ways we change things, and they're going to keep on changing. We'll be riffling along the bottom probably for a while and trying to see how we're going to put all these pieces together with a ton of uncertainty. And then eventually, hopefully, there's a future phase that I call the thrive phase, when hopefully we're building better. And I applied that initially to the workforce, and I think we talked a lot about this back in March and April. And now I think we're having a lot of the same sort of issues in effect in education, and especially since we tried during that first phase in many countries around the world to just sort of adapt very, very rapidly and do virtual and in some cases hybrid learning. Now in this new fall period, we're realizing, though, there's a whole bunch of new strategies, and there's some places, some countries where people have been reasonably prepared, and a number where there's so much uncertainty and so much challenge in terms of getting learning to all the right people. So anyway, so I'm going to stop there, but I want to say, so for Esther and for Fernando, how do you think about this period? What are some of the ways you try to help people understand what we're going through, especially when it relates to education and learning?
Who do you want to start, Gary?
Esther, you just put your hand up, Esther, so it's all yours.
So I think we have been forced, we being society, has been forced into making a huge change in education. And for many years, I've been at Palo Alto High School for 40 years. I tried to make changes in education, and they were like little changes, and then they would happen just for a year, and then they would flip back and go to the same thing. And now we are forced into making a change. And what I was trying to do in all those 40 years was to use what I call blended learning. It's a blend of the teacher being in the classroom doing some lecturing, and the computer and technology supporting that teacher and doing things that the teacher might find more difficult, or just giving the kids an opportunity to be independent and to find information out themselves. So now here we are in 2020, and I don't really have to fight to do this anymore. The whole world's doing it, but they really don't want to do it. So just to give you a little context, most of the education online are Zoom calls where the teacher is lecturing for 50 minutes and then maybe giving homework for 10. This is not the way that I envisioned it. I would like to envision, and what my suggestion is, kids have some autonomy, some freedom to explore on the web, to find out information themselves, to learn to be self-learners, and then to bring that information back and share it with the group and talk about what they found and why it is good and why it isn't good and so forth. So hopefully education will move in this direction while they're all stuck in these Zoom calls. So far, it's only been like a week and a half or 2 weeks of school, and already I hear a lot of complaints from kids and from parents. So I don't know how long it's going to last, but I would hope that they would change their pedagogy as soon as possible. That will help the kids feel much better, more empowered, and increase the learning. So now off to you, Fernando. Fernando, who is just an amazing professor at Harvard.
Esther, thanks. I think one of the silver linings of this time is that it's helped us make new friends and kind of develop trust quickly. So I met Esther a few weeks ago. I knew her work, obviously, and her famous book, but we met over a conversation. We spent an hour. And lo and behold, I'm talking to her about my children's book, and she recently met one of my sons and so on. And I think this has something to do with the moment. I mean, there is something about the vulnerability that this moment causes, where we all know that we don't know if we're going to be alive tomorrow, that anyone could be taken. And it kind of helps you put life in perspective and think about what's important. And my hope is that, I mean, to go back to your question, Gary, what does this mean for education? I think this is the big one. In the part of the world where you're in, you've been waiting for the big one for a long time. This is, of course, an earthquake. This is much worse than an earthquake in terms of a societal global disruption. Think about it for a moment. I don't think we have seen since 1930 a moment when all the economies in the world pretty much shut down at the same time. We
Right.
have had economic crisis, but they have affected regions, but they were counterbalanced by economic activity in other regions. So that kind of kept the global economy going. Not this time. And just project out what this is going to mean. You now have governments essentially printing money or borrowing money to pay for all the public health and the economic costs of this pandemic. Now, you take sub-Saharan Africa, very important region to the future of the world, with a lot of governments already on the brink of defaulting on their sovereign debt, all right? And all of a sudden, they have to absorb the cost of this. What do you think this is going to do to those economies, to the viability of the economies? What do you think that's going to do to social stability as governments are no longer able to provide social services for people? So this is serious. This is a very serious disruption. I don't know what it's going to give us. I like the optimism implicit in the framing of your question that, something good will come of these. And I want to believe that something good will come of this for humanity. And I certainly am trying to do everything I can to make sure that it comes. But it's not written in the stars that it will. It could be. It could be. I look at history. You look at the pandemic in Italy in the 1300s, and many people credit that pandemic with the Italian Renaissance because it caused people to begin to believe in human rationality, to be a lot more skeptical of political and religious authority, to be a lot more discontent with corruption, to trust themselves more. And it caused a family like the Medicis to do something very counterintuitive, to invest in the arts and in the emerging sciences in a small city where every other city in Italy was spending money they had and didn't have in wars. And they said, there's no path to anywhere investing in wars. And the fact that those people underwrote people like Leonardo and Donatello and Raphael and Michelangelo and Machiavelli eventually planted the roots for the Renaissance. So is the big reset a Renaissance, both for education and for society? I hope so. But it could lead us in a different path, right? The pandemic of 1918 really contributed to the rise of Hitler because it caused such an economic depression in Germany that municipalities found it impossible to fund social services, and that pushed a lot of people to the edges. And these disenfranchised people radicalized, and they were captured by extremely intolerant groups. Look at our own political mess in this country. Do you know where this is going to take us? Is there going to be a renaissance for this democracy or a breakdown of democracy? I don't know. But I certainly believe with you that educators have a unique opportunity and a responsibility to try to steer things more in the direction of a renaissance and less in the direction of a breakdown of civilized kind of democracy and so on. And I do think that there are some signs that this is happening. One of the things I've been doing over the last 5 months is looking at how governments at various levels around the world have responded. And the story is encouraging. There is a story of innovation, of people trying to do all kinds of things, some of them not very effective, as Esther rightly is saying. But, let's put it in perspective. It's only been 5 months. And so look at my own university, which decided over a matter of weeks that we're going to give our professional schools the authority to decide whether they want to give a degree online. In the 30-some years I've been here, I'd always been told this is never going to happen. Harvard will never allow a degree without a residential requirement. Well, this pandemic and good leadership made it happen. This is a huge opportunity. And here we are, reinventing, all of us, my colleagues and myself at various schools, reinventing ourselves, discovering how to teach effectively so that it's not all lectures on Zoom in this medium. Are we going to get it perfect the first time around? Probably not. And we may do some big gaffes like the things that Esther is describing. But are we going to learn from this? And is this going to then cause us to say, wait a moment, we were able to serve people that we had never served before. When we made the decision to go online, we reopened admissions. And we got the most diverse and experienced and accomplished class that I can remember in the 20-some years I've been on the faculty. I mean, some of these people are unbelievable. So I'm hoping that that educational institutions are going to learn from the opportunities that we have had to respond because of the emergency. But it is going to be messy. I don't expect that any of these things is going to be easy or Pollyannish. This is going to be painful. There are people hurting. I mean, 24 million people infected, 122,000 people dead. Look at the World Bank has predicted in 2 years, 60 million people brought to extreme poverty. That means less than $2 a day. There's nothing pretty about this. This is like a war. Terrible, terrible.
No.
but here we are.
Yeah. So Esther, how about you? Are you seeing?
So I think, you know, I've always been an optimist. I'm always looking for the silver lining in all the terrible things that happen to us. And I mean, I found that growing up and then going to school. If you read my book, How to Raise Successful People, you'll see this. It's a lot of stories of things that I had to overcome. But I think that the alternative is being depressed and being a pessimist. And so I was like, I'm going to be an optimist. I am going to look for the renaissance. And that's what I do. And I think there will be a renaissance in education. We have a question from somebody in the chat who asked, does that mean we're going to get rid of teachers? No, teachers are necessary all the time. By the way, do the coaches play football? Should we get rid of coaches? No, we need teachers just like we need coaches. And so in a school situation, the class can be smaller, but a football team has like, what is it, number 10 players or something like that? They have one coach.
Mm-hmm.
So we still need the coaches and we still need some guidance. But that doesn't mean teacher has to be the authority on everything. Yeah. That doesn't mean the teacher has to always say to the kids, no, do it my way. I mean, I just remember that when I went to elementary school in the 1950s and 60s, the number one goal was for me to follow instructions. I mean, I got into trouble when I didn't follow instructions. And by the time I graduated, I can tell you, I was really great at doing one thing, following instructions. But the world wasn't looking for anybody. They weren't looking for innovation. But today, we still have a system where we're trying to teach people to follow instructions when, in fact, we need people who are innovators. And you are only innovators when you do it yourself. You cannot learn to be an innovator by watching someone else do it. And so I created with my former students. As a matter of fact, I retired from the classroom, but now I'm at Stanford. And then also I started a company with my former students. It's called Tract.app, TRACT.app. And it will launch in September, sometime in September. And the goal of this company is to empower students to be, they're the creators of information and learning. And who are their target audience? Kids. So we have 14 to 18-year-olds creating information and learning and collaborating with kids 8 to 14. I'll tell you, right? I put out a request, just one request on Facebook for about an hour looking for kids who might want to be creators. And I had to take it down after an hour because I didn't want to, it was like inundated with everybody that wanted to do it. So I think that this pandemic will give us an opportunity to show that kids are really much more capable than we give them the credit for.
Just to tell our viewers, so I've actually been in Esther's classroom. She taught the journalism program at Palo Alto High School for decades. And half of the 3,000 students would go through her program, not so much because they all wanted to become journalists, although many did, but because she taught them how to think and how to learn. And I would see literally one teacher to 70 kids, because Esther did exactly what she's talking about. As she was the, not the sage on the stage, as she often talks about, she was the guide on the side. And she would tell kids things like, in every other class, the rules that she was talking about they had to follow is they had to put their digital distraction machines away. In Esther's class, you had to pull out your digital distraction machine and interview the kid next to you. And that was going to become an article you were going to put in one of the professionally produced magazines or newspapers that her students all did, with the teachers as the guides on the side. And so this isn't theory. This is totally doable. What she's talking about is totally, now I think there are a bunch of challenges as we shift to the virtual, which is what I think a lot of our questioners are asking. They're asking, so Stam is asking, what will happen to interaction if kids are online 100% of the time? Ashok is asking, what kinds of student-teacher ratios should we have in this new era? So I'd love to get your, both.
I just want to answer one question on that.
Sure.
And so in this spring, when I had to take everybody online, right? Because that was the requirement. School is all online. The main difference, my class from all the other classes, guess who was in charge of the Zoom calls?
The students.
The students.
Yeah, of
I
course.
put them all
Yeah.
in charge of the Zoom
Yeah.
calls. So
Yeah.
there was never a problem of anyone showing up. They all wanted to see each other. It was fun. And in addition, they came up with the idea that they were going to publish the newspaper anyway. They weren't going to let a little old pandemic stop them. Do you think they would have done this if I were in charge? No. People want to be responsible themselves. They want to be respected. They want to do it themselves. So this fall, they're doing the same thing. The kids are putting out a publication on their own. I'm so proud of them, honestly.
That's awesome.
That
So
is what I'm trying to say.
I agree with Esther that one of the potential silver linings of this pandemic is that we will discover the importance of cultivating the agency of students as you have been doing in your classes, Esther, and of putting them in charge and so on. I think the analogy that you use with the coaches is very apt because the first thing that came to mind, one of my sons is an athlete, is that, and I have observed a lot of his practice and his coaching, and good coaches get to know the whole person. Good coaches never just see the kid through a little funnel as the basketball player, but they get to know them and they engage them in activities that develop the whole person. And maybe that is also going to be part of what we discover, that in order to do what you're describing, I haven't been in your classroom, but I bet you that you develop very good relationships with your students, that you don't just see them as the person who can create the company, but you get to know who they are. You check in with them. And I think this pandemic is causing educators to have to do that. I think one of the silver linings of the current moment is that every teacher has gotten to know, if they're paying attention, their students and their environments a lot better than they did before. And vice versa. Parents have gotten to know the teachers a lot better than they did before. And if those relationships are respectful as they should be, and relationships of mutuality, only good things can come from that partnership. And when you think about the world before this pandemic, it wasn't always respectful. It wasn't always a relationship of mutuality, right? So I'm hoping that we're going
I
to discover that.
agree
Yeah, yeah.
100%. So,
Yeah.
you know what I find really interesting is that when a teacher who a student usually respects because they're the teacher, when a teacher believes in you and says that you can do it, it is just like a miracle. I discovered this by accident. These kids become what you expect them to become. They rise to the occasion. They don't even know they're doing it, but they do. And so I've had kids who literally started in the 9th grade, and I wondered, like, what did you do in the first 9 years? Did you learn to read or write? But somehow the fact that I liked them, I got to know them as a human being, I cared about them, I respected their intelligence. Oh my God, it made the difference in the world. They all, I mean, I don't really have any kids that graduated without excellent reading and writing skills and knowing all the technical stuff that was required to put a newspaper out online, which is what they do. If you take a look at the newspaper at Palo Alto High School, you'll see it's a full-size newspaper. It kind of looks like the New York Times.
Yeah.
And the reason it does is because they like the New York Times. So they sort of copy a lot of the ideas.
So Esther, and Fernando as well. Typically when I talk about sort of the learning arena, not just education but learning, we tend to historically have sort of grouped them into sort of 3 domains. We've got pre-K to K-12. We've got sort of the young adult launch pad, which today we call college, and then we've got later adult learning. And I want to talk about each of those in turn, but a lot of the questions seem to be, so for Denise, for instance, is asking about how to solve the problem of public schools where kids have no access to the internet and that sort of thing. So I think one of the greatest challenges of this era is the combination of access and agency. It's agency, if you can go to a school, it's, the most agency you ask from a kid is to show up, but now there's no school to go to. And now they've got to show up for a Zoom call, but there's also access. They can't show up for the Zoom call if there's no internet access, if they don't have the environment in their homes. And so are there any Solomonic sort of wave the magic wand solutions here, or is that the problem we have to solve
I,
first?
I think go back to, there's a lot of wisdom in this comment that Esther made when she said the problem is that a lot of people are using Zoom to teach lectures. Unpack that for a moment. What that is saying is that a lot of people are distracted with what it really means and not ends. A lot of people think that the problem is the content, and it's how do you deliver the content and how do you do what the district expects you to do, as opposed to thinking clearly about what are the learning outcomes that we should be cultivating, and why don't we think a little bit more flexibly and imaginatively about how to engage kids in activities where they get to those learning outcomes. Maybe what they need to do is let go of the Zoom for a while and read a book, or talk to their parents, or observe outside the window, or connect with their peers in WhatsApp and do some kind of a project that will engage them over a period. In other words, engage the students and engage the teachers in a process of reimagining what are the means, as opposed to obsessing over how do we use this new disrupted architecture that we have to push the content that we're pushing in the previous thing. It didn't work very well before. It's not going to work very well with a machine that is half broken now.
That's
So,
right. It
yeah,
doesn't work. It didn't work well before, and it's not
yeah,
going to work well now. And a
yeah,
lot of the stuff we were pushing before was irrelevant. That's why 70% of it was forgotten after 2 weeks. You know, kids only remember 32% of what they learned, even if they got an A on the test after two
mm-hmm,
weeks, because it
mm-hmm,
was irrelevant.
mm-hmm.
But there's a question here about parents are creating small group pods of children where the parents are collaborating to teach enrichment in their pods.
It is actually by
Do
my friend
Yeah,
Denise.
what skills should we focus on, and do you think this is a good idea? Number one, I'll start with yes, it's a great idea. Because the number one reason it's a good idea, put those kids together so they can actually see each other. You know, so you can have a group of 5 families, each family can take one day of the week. And, you know, if they just have an hour or two of interaction time, that's going to be a heck of a lot more than most kids are getting.
But Esther, can everybody, I mean, there's a lot of families, especially for frontline workers and people with less money and access, may not even have that capacity. How can we help them? I mean, you know, the pods are increasingly being done by people who have the resources, and not always by those that don't.
Well, if you live in a small apartment where you don't have a lot of access, you can still invite in one other child. All it takes, honestly, you just need to have interaction with one other human being to
Right.
make you feel good. We only marry one person normally, right? Unless we're
Oh,
kind of in it from a different group.
yeah.
But I mean, you just need one person. Actually, there's research that shows that you only need one person in all 12 years of your schooling to believe in you to make a difference.
Yeah.
And most kids, sadly to say, can't even find one. And so that is what you need. Just invite the kid next door or the kid down the street or your child's best friend. So within a small group, 2 families, 3 families, you can, you know, we have to hope that your risk of getting the disease is going to be minimized because you've cut down the number of kids, cut down a number of interactions. I was reading something about flying on the plane, by the way. Did you know your chance of getting COVID on a plane is 1 in 4,002? Did you know? So it sounded pretty good to me. And if there's nobody in the middle seat, it's 1 in 7,000 is your chances of getting it. So if you invite some little kid over to play, you know, it's not like you're on an airplane for 5 hours, right? Your chances of some kind of interaction is pretty small, but it's going to make a big difference to that kid.
Esther, but Gary asked a very good question about inequality. I agree with you that those learning pods, providing kids an opportunity to be with other kids, with someone who can guide their learning, is going to be very good. And we know that not everyone has that opportunity at the moment. So it's clear that this is only going to augment the divides based on social class of origin that our schools already perpetuate. So, I mean, you remember we invented the public school to try to level the playing field.
Right.
and now it's hampered in its ability to do that. But I do think, Gary, the way to think about that shouldn't be, well, because this is going to further inequalities, we should prohibit it or make it difficult. Rather, the question should be, how do we make this possible for everybody? And so here's a thought. In this country, we have 4,500 universities that have the task of educating these young people, to become responsible adults. And some of them, if you watch the news, are not behaving like responsible adults in terms of how they're congregating and spreading disease and so on. Service is a phenomenal way of developing character and leadership. And many universities understand that. And you have great programs in this country like City Year and others that engage college students or graduates in some task of service. Can you think of a better way to be of service right now to the nation if you're a young person in college than to lead a pod on a voluntary basis? Why couldn't we get if our 4,000 universities, if only half of them actually made a commitment to being part of the solution to the looming crisis on education that this pandemic is creating by engaging their students in leading some of those pods, you would have two people benefit. You would
That
have the
is
kids
such a
and the
great
college
idea.
students, right?
Such a
And the
that
college
is,
students.
So
yes.
I just grabbed the URL podsforamerica.com. So
But what Fernando's suggesting is that students in college
absolutely.
spend a little bit of time donating that time to families to help them with their kids.
So
What a great idea.
properly supported by their colleges, right? Giving them the support they need so they do a good job. Yeah, I think that it's an example. I mean, it's an idea we're just thinking about it, but I'm sure that if we put our minds, and many more people put their minds around the question of how do we actually build that renaissance in education? How do we deploy underutilized resources for this purpose? I'm sure we can come up with 100 ideas like this, 1,000 ideas. But we have to stop thinking about how do we package what we're doing before in these new means and instead accept this is a big disruption. It's your big reset. We want it to be the big reset to bring to the Renaissance. What do we need to do to get there? How do we think imaginatively about doing that? And I'm hopeful that some of those things are happening. And maybe what we should do is spend more time trying to find out who's doing those things and building a narrative around it so that we build a new accountability. I mean, give you an example of what I think could go very wrong. This morning, I was talking to a number of educators in Moscow, and the president of Russia basically put in the development plan that within the next 10 years, Russia needs to be one of the top 10 in the global benchmarks. What a disaster, right? And this whole thing was about how do we move up these rankings of the tests? What a disaster. And the whole point of my conversation was, why don't you forget about the test for a moment and look outside the window of the school? And what you see is a world on fire. The world is on fire. Every educator should be asking, how do I educate my kids so that they can, out of these ashes, build a better world? That's what we should be doing, not trying to climb up the rankings on the tests and so on.
So absolutely. I think a lot of what we've been talking about has been domain of K-12 and younger people, but we're seeing a lot of the same sorts of impacts now in that that young adult launchpad of college. And as you guys know, I wrote a piece going 6-7 years ago called Unbundling Higher Education, where I basically said I think that we're gonna hit a point where we're going to realize that a whole bunch of the ways that we package things together for that young adult launchpad and the way they learn things that we call degrees and so on, that is eventually going to start to unbundle. And actually, David W. is asking questions about that. For instance, like, so will there be a breakdown in these college-centric learning communities? Will there be, kids taking courses from multiple colleges simultaneously? Will it essentially unbundle in the way that the media business unbundled? Do you see the same sort of transition now in higher ed? And what should higher ed be doing to actually build for the much better world that you're talking about, Fernando?
So let me.
Fernando already said one thing, and that is kids from all the universities should spend some time helping these families.
Done.
What a great idea that is.
Yeah. So let me first put this in perspective, saying that universities have been part of the secret sauce of this country since for the last 100 years. The country has 4,500 universities out of 28,000 in the world, and many of them are the most socially embedded universities, by which I mean universities that really are the core, think about Stanford, of the creation, or think about MIT, the creation of engines of development of the communities of which they are a part. The reason I find it necessary to say this in the context of unbundling is because this is the first time, I think, in American history where people are beginning to wonder what is the value of universities, of knowledge and expertise. And I think that's a very dangerous line. It's all part of this populist, nativist kind of thinking that says magic and science are the same thing. Very dangerous path. Look at where the country is, because we have a president who doesn't understand science or doesn't know how to make public policy based on scientific knowledge. Having said that, our universities have big problems because even though they are, certainly some of the best universities in the world are in this country, it doesn't mean that each of the 4,500 is a leading university in the world. And one of the things that, that animated our universities for a good part of the last 50 years was the mission of democratizing access, which was beautiful. I mean, the spirit of we're going to make it possible for everybody to come to university. That's great. At the same time, as the population is declining, if it were not for immigrants, the U.S. would be like Europe, right? We don't reproduce to maintain the population. A lot of universities are in search of a mission, and that's the moment that we're in. There's a lot of confusion in some universities. I don't mean Stanford or MIT or Harvard, but within those 4,500. And some of them have business models that are not sustainable. How do I know that are not sustainable? Because when you have an institution that has to raise a lot of money, ask for charity to pay for the business doesn't work. It costs you more to run the business than the money that you're able to capture. And so there are a lot of people thinking about that, but it's possible that some of these universities will not be viable and that this crisis is only going to accelerate that. That may not be a bad thing. It may not be a bad thing if our leadership in the university embraces this notion of what does it mean to be socially embedded in this moment? What does it mean to be responsible for the Renaissance, which I hope many universities will do. Not all of them are at the moment. Some are kind of looking at their own. I think some of the leaders in higher education are behaving in ways that are not setting a very good example. For example, when they insist that their students should come back, and they are clearly a lot more interested in the bottom line and in making sure that they're viable than they're interested in protecting the health of their own students. I think this is the time when universities could make some bold and courageous decisions and lead the country, show what it means to lead, as universities have at other times in history. So it's going to be a time where I imagine, like in other spheres, we're going to see a real separation between those who led this country into a renaissance and those who were just looking at and how to survive. And sadly, we'll only know in hindsight who was who.
So we know why the universities want everybody to come back on campus.
Yeah.
They want the tuition.
Correct. Yeah.
And so it's the same reason that the SAT people did not cancel the SAT exam,
Correct.
even though they gave it a abridged form of it. Correct. So there's a question in the chat about, should parents be paying $50,000 a year for university, when in fact I'm suggesting that their kids go out and be tutors for families that don't have any tutor. It's a good question. I think the universities need to cooperate in this and, reduce the tuition in some way, or give kids some kind of credit for working with the families. And the leadership at the universities are the ones that should come up with this idea, because, you and I, okay, you're a professor. I actually teach at Stanford as well. I mean, we're just one of many people in the university. We don't make those decisions, but we can make suggestions.
Yeah, it's a very complicated question. I think the answer is a broader answer. There have been times, for example, World War II, when universities understood that they had a responsibility to the nation, and they actually sacrificed in a number of ways, engaging their faculty, realizing you have to engage in this war, for example. I think this is a comparable time where part of what leadership needs to convey is a deep an understanding of the deep severity of this crisis. Not in the moment. It's not the fact that you can get sick right now. It's the crisis that is coming. I mean, I'm sure that if we were very clear that we're going to be in an economic depression like the 1930s, people would wake up. It's not clear that we're there. We don't know if we're going to end up there, right? We all have great confidence in our ability of the Federal Reserve Bank to prevent that and economic policy, but we don't know what the um, multiplier effects of what's happening in the rest of the world are going to be in the US economy. And so I think that the question of tuition in the short term, it's very difficult to answer, because if you have an institution where the costs are fixed, right? Your costs are your costs, and it doesn't really matter. You still have to pay them whether you have students, whether you have half of the students, or whether you have all the students. So if you only look at 1 year, you can't answer that question. But if you look beyond a year, 5 or 10 years, then you could argue, for example, this is a time when many organizations, not just universities, it would make sense for you to borrow money, because this is not necessarily a structural deficit. This is a situation that you hope will go away. The problem is that for some universities, it is a structural deficit. So they know they cannot borrow because they have been unsustainable for a long time. And they're just hoping for 1 more year, 2 more years. And I think in those cases, those are the universities that may not survive, right? As soon as their ratings are known and it's impossible for them to borrow money, that's the end. And I think we're going to see that happening in every state. It's happening in my state.
No,
I think it's right.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's Dermot, actually, from the SU team, is talking about so he's asking the question of what will be some of the ramifications of that. Will there be consolidation if the system doesn't evolve? And so I want to offer to the viewers just the one way to think about this. So, and I know I used the analogy with media business just because I'm a recovering journalist. And I 25 years ago, basically we had a magazine called Interactive Week where we sort of mapped the development of the internet industry and also the impact on the media business. And so one way to think about it is sort of a pyramid, right? Is that a lot of markets sort of are in pyramids. And so at the top, there's sort of the top brand, right? So the Harvards and Stanfords. And then and at the baseline, you can think of, well, that's our community colleges or local. And then there's sort of in this middle, there's more the liberal arts and other maybe some technical colleges. But what happens, unfortunately, is more and more of the dynamics of the internet take hold. Normally, the ones that we think of as the strongest brands, that they'll do just fine, right? The Harvards and the Stanfords normally do fine, and then because the friction to entry at the bottom, you find that a lot of we're starting to see a lot of community colleges are shifting, becoming more vocationally oriented, and they'll probably adapt too. The middle is very hard. We lost an awful lot of media companies that were in the middle, that when it's a nice healthy pyramid, everybody can sort of flourish. And the internet tends to evaporate the middle. And so what happens when you unbundle these things is that if you've got now two kids that are learning online and they're each taking Lit 101 from 2 different colleges, and they realize, well, wait a minute, you're paying so much for this college for Lit 101, but this one from the community college is so much cheaper. Wait a minute, what's the difference? And what does that distill down to the core of what the offering is? And so I think that's where we're at that cusp now, where a lot of students and parents are going through trying to do that math and figure out, well, if I can't do the place-based well or completely, what will that new model be? And I think that's to your point, Fernando, this is where administrators will need to become very adaptive and very creative. And what we found in the media business is that ultimately that people just pay less. That is, if the kids start coming not for 4 years, but for 3 or 2, or and they're learning a lot more online, the business model must change.
I agree 100%. But perhaps one difference with the media business is the following here. If you think that the mission of universities is to educate kind of post-adolescents to adults, the market for people past their college years is huge and vastly underserved. And the needs for lifelong learning for high quality lifelong learning. I mean, we're living in a time when everybody's going to have to reinvent themselves multiple times. And when you look at the number of universities that actually take that population seriously, it's very small. So you're right. What we need is a leadership that understands, okay, there is a market that is drying up, and those are the high school graduates. But there are two markets that are not drying up. One is a lot of low-income kids and and ethnic minority kids who have not been as well served as white, more affluent kids by colleges. So there's still a market here. It's the only market that's growing actually for colleges. And you have all the adults who need to reinvent themselves. Let's change the institution. And I perhaps this pandemic and the adjustments that we make will speed that a little bit. In other words, I do think there is a market for what a university can do. I truly fear a time when we begin to glorify ignorance. And, you know, I'm not making this up. We have a president who said, I love the uneducated. We are living at a time when for the first time, a lot of people are saying, you know, maybe we should tax universities. What good do they do for society? Well, you want to know what education does for society? Look at societies where people are not educated and see if that's where you will want to be. And to some extent, some of the challenges that we have in this nation have something to do with the lack of quality education that a lot of people receive. And you can sell them a bill of goods because they can think. And you tell them they can wash their bodies with Clorox or something like that, and this be like a vaccine. I mean, you laugh, but when you put this, imagine in 50 years, people writing about this period, they're going to say, it was crazy. What was happening in this nation at this time was out of this world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just want to say something about this university structure. I think it is being challenged already right now, and it will continue to be challenged. So Google is challenging the way that we teach right now. They have a 2-year course that is offered through Coursera. You take that course and then it's on programming and computer science and so forth. After 2 years, you can get a job, and the job's salary starts at $100,000. So, you know, the question is, why would I want to go to college and major in medieval history, for example, even though I love it? And also the other thing is that I'm also working with a group that is putting out a 2-year program, engineering program through UC Berkeley. And this program is going to do the same thing. It's going to compete with Coursera, and it will compete with another program called Holberton, where we're going to be training people for 2 years in social emotional skills, design, and computer skills. And it's called WAJ International. It's sort of named after me, not so surprising, Gary.
Absolutely.
And the first place it's going to be implemented is in Jamaica, which is actually pretty exciting. And there'll be other places where it's also going to be moving. But I think the goal, or my goal in this, is to give people skills that they can actually use in life to have a better life. You know, right now, you try to hire a back-end engineer, I can tell you, it's going to cost you $500,000. It's ridiculous.
I agree, and I think it doesn't have to be either or. It's and both. Meaning, yes, we should be a lot more effective at providing pathways to good jobs where people can provide for themselves and for their families, probably beginning in high school, and fostering those integrations between education and industry, and finding more effective way to help people find skills in areas with your jobs. That's one issue. And at the same time, we should be building a series of opportunities for people to educate themselves the whole time and to learn, I don't know, medieval history, but certainly history. You know what happens to populations that don't know their history and or that don't know the history of the world.
Well, they could do that. They could study that, but look at all the stuff they're studying instead.
Yeah.
I mean, just look at our president can't even figure out what countries are where in the world.
Yeah, exactly. So I agree with you that we should be building pathways that help people earn a living. That's one thing.
Right.
And we should also be build a more educated society. And I think that the fact that we have this infrastructure, that we have what has been the most successful university system in the world is something that we shouldn't abandon it. We should understand that there are places that envy the United States
They
because
can,
we're able to do this.
right, but they can update it a little bit.
Yes, I agree a lot. I
Yeah,
agree. Yes, I
absolutely.
agree.
I mean, I think that just the way I sort of thread some of the things that you both are talking about is, first off, it's inevitable that more and more learning, especially will be connected to something that relates to the work, the skills that are necessary, both unfortunately what we call hard skills, the knowledges, and what we unfortunately call soft skills, the transferable skills that are usable in a range of situations. So first, that's number one. Is it, yes, it will be connected more to work. Secondly, more and more will be just in time and just in context. That is, it won't be a 4-year CS degree thinking about what products I might eventually do, and it will be immediately jumping in, learning coding, and developing products that can ship. That's just an example. So now, what do we lose in that? And we've seen this again, and industry after industry that unbundles is a number of things. First off, it requires much more agency by the learner. If all you need to do is continually go back to school and show up every day for a degree that your parents are paying for, or that the government is paying for, then that doesn't take quite as much agency as that. Now, if we start to pull a lot of these pieces apart, we must have well-driven learners. And the second, again, is access. Is yes, we can throw a lot of these things online, but there are many people around the world where the systems are not designed to give them access to this, where employers are not treating the learning from the things that they did online as making them more hireable. And so without those elements, we have the potential for actually creating a greater gap than closing the gap.
Well, we're trying. So there's a school in Mexico that's opening up in Monterrey, and the goal of the school is to teach social emotional skills and some history and also technology skills. I mean, it's really practical, but it also teaches you how to take care of yourself. It teaches you, I mean, there's so many things that you can be studying besides some of the things that are required for people to learn. And I think it will make a big difference. And so this is coming in Mexico. And I think we can do it all over the world. There's no reason why it can't be everywhere. And I mean, it's the university leaders that have to help us. What's the name of the school in Monterrey, Mexico? It's called Ferrara Wojcicki. How's that?
Yeah.
You know where that came from, Gary. We won't talk about that.
I was just on a call with Jorge, so yeah. Yes.
Yeah, it's Ferrara, Ferrera, and it's going to be opening next fall in Monterrey, Mexico, and that's the goal of that school.
Yeah.
Yes, you
And
got
also,
it right, Ferrara.
Esther mentioned Holberton, which is fascinating model, which is mostly teaching coders, but there are no teachers. It's there's a little bit of place-based part of it, but a lot of it's learning online. Students learn in cohorts, and the teachers basically are just helping them to solve specific problems. But all the grading and the collaboration between the students is done online. So that's another great model. Holberton, Holberton, is another.
Right. Also, that's built on a lot of what I have in my pedagogy, which is that you aren't graded until you get it right. So it's a mastery system. Yeah. You keep working on it till you get it right. Some people take, 5 minutes to learn it, and some people take 50 minutes to learn it. My theory, I don't care how long it takes you to learn it, just learn it. And when you learn it, I'm done. I'm ready for you. So I think that system also is more encouraging for students, because you get really depressed when you get a bad grade, and then you average that bad grade with another bad grade, and finally you get it right and you get an A, but then you have to average the D and the C with your A, and you end up with the C+, and then you get miserable.
Okay, so I'm just gonna go there. So Fernando, are grades and degrees going to degrade or change or go away, or will that always be sort of one context for how we rate?
I don't know how quickly they will change. I mean, I hope it changes quickly. I hope we move to a world quickly in which people learn because they value learning and they understand the authentic connections of where learning leads. And I think when Esther creates the experience she's describing for her students in treating them like they're smart human beings and telling them you can do something like the New York Times, that is the kind of motivation that learning should be depending on, and not extrinsic things like grades or the opinion of your professor of the work you've done or something like that. And I think it is, I don't know very many employers that currently look at anybody's grades or their transcripts. The only people I think that look at grades are people in admissions committees of subsequent education. My sense is that increasingly, this is more true in some fields than in others, employers have a way to know what you can do. And if not, they can figure it out very quickly. And that's what they're interested in. What can you do? And they're a lot less interested in where you learned it. That's the unbundling
Right.
piece,
They don't
right?
care where you
They
learned
don't
it.
care
They
where you
want to
learned
know
it.
whether you know how to do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of those things are actually not just hard skills. I mean, I write a lot of letters from recruiters for my students, and so much of that is about self-knowledge and working with other people and dependability and conscientiousness, the kinds of things that I guess you would call soft, which are not really very soft. They sit in the same brain as the hard skills. And but I do think we should be a lot more intentional about cultivating those things, right? Like if collaboration is essential, if no one will hire you, if you're not a collaborator, maybe we should, as a matter of design, say, okay, when do we create opportunities for people to actually collaborate as part of the
Bravo.
learning? And why don't we
Yes.
take that as a goal? So yeah, I think that all these props that we have created, kind of grades and transcripts and so on, at a moment like this, and at a moment of disruption, this is a time when people say, wait a moment, what's essential? That's what I meant earlier when I said we should be a lot more focused on goals and outcomes and a lot more flexible on means to get there. But that's what I hope will happen. You ask me, are they going to go away anytime soon? I don't know. I don't know.
Esther, what are you hopeful about? We're almost out of time. So, and I just want to tell people before we lose our audience, we're going to continue the thread on su.org on the community site, and we'd love to have you all come join us. I'm going to post the questions we were not able to answer then, and hopefully we can have more of a continued dialogue there. But I just want to give each of you a chance to sort of sum up a little bit. And it's always nice to leave people with a note of hope. So Esther, just, what some of the things, what would be an insight or two you'd want to make sure to leave people with that would be most helpful in thinking about this great reset of learning going forward?
Well, so I'm very hopeful, especially because of this company my students have set up called track.app, because it's a way for students who are teenagers to share their knowledge with kids that are just a little bit younger. So it focuses on them and makes them into somewhat like YouTube heroes. And the younger kids love being involved, and they're learning they don't realize they're learning. It's gamification of learning. So I'm very hopeful that this will be something that will continue. I'm also hopeful that people will learn that working together and all the social emotional skills are more important than memorizing all those things in a class. Social emotional skills are critical, as we can see, getting along in the world today, because it's a world that we don't even recognize. And the people that are doing best are the ones that have empathy and compassion and ability to think outside the box and not afraid to be kind and supportive. And that's what I'm hopeful about.
And I'll just be your publicist here, and I'll tell you that Esther also has a book on how to raise successful people, which talks about exactly how you do that. So, and Fernando, how about you?
I don't know that I'll be hopeful, but I certainly want to end in a call for action. I do think we're living a very critical moment in the history of humanity. I would say even a dangerous moment. I do not think it is written in the stars whether at the end of this calamity we end up with a breakdown of democracy in a number of societies, or we end up with a renaissance. I think whether we go one way or the other really depends on what each and every one of us does to step up to the moment and to understand the deep severity of the crisis. There is nothing hopeful for the 60 million people who have been thrown into abject poverty. There is nothing hopeful for the almost million people who have died and for their families. There is nothing hopeful for the 24 million who've been infected, many more than should, because their leaders were not up to the job. So this is a serious, serious moment, and people are watching. Now, what happens in a society when a lot of people conclude we had many people died because our leaders were not up to the job? Does that lead to anarchy and to the breakdown of social institutions, or does it lead to a renewal? It depends on what we each do, right? And it depends on whether we decide that we're going to be crew or passengers. And I think this is a time when we all need to be crew, and we all need to have great compassion and solidarity, and yes, spread peace and calm and help build hope, not on the basis of lying, not on the basis of denying. This is no picnic what we're in. This is serious. But I think we have the tools better than any time in history to rise to the occasion, to build a renaissance. They exist. They exist in small events like this, in these conversations. They exist in the tools that all of us have at our disposal every day. The real question is, do we have the will to do what is our responsibility? Do we want to be, each of us, an actor in a process so that when this is over, we can at least say, I did my best. I did my best to lead us into the renaissance. And my invitation to everyone who's listening to us is that we all really are empowered to make this our problem. This is not somebody else's problem. This is our problem. That's where I'd like to end.
Oh, yeah. Bravo, Fernando. That was fantastic.
So I'll just want to maybe offer a closing thought. So to Fernando and to Esther's points, I mean, we are in a unique time in history. We don't get to choose. We don't get to choose the time that we're here. And I think we're at this pivot point. This great reset has certainly shown us that we're at a pivot point when it comes to learning. And I think we have opportunities, right? So what I think a lot of the discussion has been around is, if we have the agency, if we see this, if we are crew, if we are taking responsibility to try to build that better future, there's a range of scenarios from very dystopian to maybe not utopian, but certainly a much better future that we can build if we actually do see this as opportunity. There's no, if there's a single takeaway I think we've all gotten from looking into each other's homes from Zoom is that there's more that unites us than pulls us apart in this area. We're all going through, half the world has been going through a very similar set of experiences, all simultaneously. When in human history has that ever happened? And I think many of us are realizing that despite all the challenges, besides so many of the mechanical issues that we're trying to deal with in reacting to this, these unique times, is that actually we're starting to realize we have the pieces in place where we can build better. And so I think that's what I'd like to charge us all with, is keep the dialogue going, be continually thinking of this, not as something that is being done to, but where you actually, no matter what your role is, student, learner, teacher, parent, administrator, part of the community ecosystem, all of us have this opportunity and I think this responsibility to try to help build better for the future. So I want to thank Fernando, thank Esther, thank all of you for your attention, and I look forward to having interaction on the Singularity site. And thanks to Cody, as always, for guiding the technology to keep this moving. So
thank you for having us.
Yes,
good.
Thank you,
Take care.
Gary.
Stay healthy.
Great job. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.